To the Michael Lofton Show here on Reason and Theology. Today we are talking about the Shroud of Turin, the history of it, as well as evidence in its favor that it really is the shroud that covered Jesus, our Lord, whenever he resurrected from the dead. And we are also going to field questions towards the end, as well as address some objections against the authenticity of the Shroud of Turin. Joining me to walk us through all of this is Guy Powell. Welcome to the show, Guy. How are you?
Michael, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it and look forward to always talking about the Shroud.
Now, you have a book on this specifically, right? I think
I
through
do,
the
absolutely.
history of the Shroud.
Yes, it's called The Only Witness, a historical fiction, actually, a historical fiction of the Shroud of Turin. And the problem is that I wanted to make for people that might be interested in it, I wanted to make it kind of easy to read and easy to learn about some of the history that took place over the last 2,000 years, but also then a potential history of what happened to the Shroud over those 2,000 years. So I made it into a fiction, and so it has the historical components. So it's kind of a historical fiction with a handful of short stories in there to talk about the history of the Shroud.
That's fun. And also very exciting because I think it's important for us to understand the history behind this shroud. I've heard people say, oh, look, this is from the medieval period, from the 1200s or so. So maybe just start us out from the very beginning about the history of the shroud.
Sure. Well, if you go back to the Gospels, in the Bible, and in all four Gospels, there are different stories about the scourging, the passion, the crucifixion, and then the resurrection. And all of them have slightly different takes on what happened, which is not unusual. I mean, if you went into court and you had all four witnesses saying exactly the same thing, you would kind of think that there was some kind of collusion possibly. So there's four stories that talk about that crucifixion and resurrection, and and the passion. And the shroud first appears as a linen cloth in the Gospels, and it's purchased by Joseph of Arimathea. He's a rich man, and he purchases the cloth so that he would be able to wrap the body of Jesus Christ when it comes down from the cross. And so it kind of starts really from that point as to what happened to that cloth, and is it potentially the one that we now have that's in Turin, Italy? Is that one then the same one that Joseph of Arimathea purchased, that he, based on the Gospels, wrapped Jesus's body with, placed the body into the tomb with the shroud over it? And then what happened afterward? And so the four Gospels, of course, go through the crucifixion and the scourging. And those four stories have very interesting details in them, which outline a lot of the markings that you can find on the body that's then imaged on this cloth. And, so a couple of them, just to point out a few, some of the ones that I like, there's a crown or a cap of thorns. So you see blood droplets on the cloth around the head. You see a notched beard where supposedly the Roman soldiers ripped out a part of their beard as part of their torturing. You see beating on the face, and the Roman guards, as well as the Hebrew temple guards, were beating Jesus. You see scourge marks of a scourge, of a flagellum, it's called, where he was beaten and whipped over 100 times. You see then, of course, the nail wounds in his hands and feet, where he was then nailed to the cross. And then lastly, which you see from the Gospels, you see then there's a side wound where the lance was then, where his side was pierced with a lance that probably, if he wasn't dead already, which most people believe he was, pierced his heart and pierced his lungs. And then at that moment, blood and serum flowed out of that wound, and then was then captured at some point on in the shroud.
Well, I suppose I want to maybe ask this question. It seems like there's pretty good indication that Christians would have preserved this. I mean, from day one, because when I look at the martyrdom of Polycarp, a second century description of early apostolic father who knew the apostle John whenever he was martyred, the account notes that his bones were preserved. In other words, the practice of relics. Um, they were preserved in order to venerate the saint, not to worship him, but to venerate them. Now, if that were true and this were a practice that early on for saints, I would certainly think that Christians would have preserved something from our Lord. So it makes sense that this would have survived, at least at the very, at a very early period. Now, whether or not that gets us all the way to the present with the Shroud of Turin is a different subject, but it does definitely make sense that Christians would have preserved it. What do you think of that?
Oh, absolutely. And if in a normal burial, then the body would be placed into a tomb. It might lay there for 6 months, a year, and then as the body decayed, and then the bones were remaining, those would have been put into an ossuary, and then those would have been kept, and you would have had a family ossuary, and then all the bones of the family might be in there. In Jesus's case, it was right as Passover was beginning, and they needed to get the burial completed. And so, by most accounts, it's kind of believed that he died about 3 o'clock. It may not have been until about 3 or 4 or so, and I don't remember the exact time now, but that he then was taken down and brought over to the tomb, and his body was prepared, but they didn't have enough time to completely prepare it for the tomb. And so then on the Sunday morning, when the women, Mary Magdalene and a couple of others, and it's not quite clear how many were there, but a handful of women came to the tomb, and they were going to finish preparing the body, that they noticed that the stone was rolled away, and then they ran back, told Peter and John, and it was Peter and John, the two disciples, then ran to the tomb, and then they saw the cloths lying there. So there's 2 or 3 references in John chapter 20 that say they saw the cloths lying there, and so that's then kind of proof that at least from a gospel perspective, that there were cloths, that the body was now missing. And so then when they saw that, then it had blood on it, and so then from that perspective, they probably would have wanted to keep it. And at that point, they probably would have seen that there was an image on it that had been, potentially, been imprinted on it during the resurrection.
Because it's somewhat apparent. I mean, you can still see the image even without special lighting, right? I mean, I'm looking at an image of it right now. In fact, I'll see if I can pull it up here on the screen in just a moment. But you can kind of see a faint image there.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I could definitely see that. Like I said, I'll try to get it pulled up here on the screen in just a moment. Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm sorry,
absolutely. And so then you can see the image, the positive image, and it is pretty faint. But then what happened, just from some historical stuff, in 1898 is when Secundo Pia, he then actually took a photograph of the
uh-huh.
shroud, and then during that photographic process, he saw a negative, because that at the time you take a negative and then you turn that into a positive, and then that whole process, which most people aren't familiar with today. And then that's when really the contrast came out, and that's then as well what you see on the front cover here in the black and white of my book, is then that image is pretty close to what
Mhm.
Secunda Pia would have seen at that moment.
Well, Google's not being very friendly to me right now. It's not liking the image type, so we'll come back to that. But yeah, so maybe try to walk us through the history of this. How do we get from the first century to pretty much the Middle Ages? Is there historical attestation to the existence of the Shroud of Turin in the first millennium?
Yeah, absolutely. There's actually even a possible reference. And one of the challenges that you have with any of the references that date to the first couple of hundred years after the death of Christ, is that the disciples were very concerned that if people found out about it, that either the Jews at the time or potentially the Romans at the time would have wanted to take possession of that and then destroyed it. And so then there was this thing called the discipline of the secret. It lasted about the first 500 years, and then it was to keep the existence of the shroud secret. Now, Paul writes in one of his letters in his letter to the Galatians 3:1, he says, "You have seen the image of the risen Christ." And then he goes on from there, but that's one reasonably good reference that says you have seen the image of the risen Christ, not of the Christ, not of a painted Christ, but of the risen Christ. And so that most scholars believe that was one of the first references to the shroud. Now there are a number of other references that take place, and it's believed that Peter would take the shroud back and forth as he was evangelizing between Jerusalem and Antioch, and then back and forth. And there's a handful of kind of rough references to it. In some of the non-canonical gospels, you'll see some references to an image and things like that. There's, for example, there's the Gospel of Nicodemus, and there's something in there. And there's a couple of other, non-canonical kinds of references to it. So there is something with a cloth that has an image on it that seems to be reasonably well referenced during those first couple hundred years.
And let me follow up with a question here. So, as far as you have seen the risen Lord, I think of something like Galatians 3:1, where he tells the Galatians, before your very eyes was Jesus Christ was clearly portrayed as crucified. Now, the way I understood that, that just kind of means that the proclamation of the gospel was so vivid that they had seen the crucified Christ. Could that be what Paul is referring to when he speaks of the risen Lord? Or do you think that no, the exegetical weight seems to lend support for a reference to the shroud?
Yeah. I've talked to gospel writing scholars, and they say that it's a pretty good chance. It's nothing is 100%. Maybe it's a 75% chance that was a reference to them seeing the face of the risen Lord there in that chapter 3:1. And then of course, there's always some doubt. Okay, it could be something, but it's different references like that to seeing an image on a cloth, over the first few hundred years that takes place. Now, there are a couple of other cloths that potentially have different images on them, but this is the one that that really is the one that I think people are referring to, that makes the most sense.
Yeah, because I think there's the other cloths, like the one with Veronica wiping his face.
Yep.
Right. Yeah.
Yep, the veil of Veronica, and then there's a thing called the Mandylion. The veil of Veronica is, and those are it's supposedly being kept in the Vatican, and that one is kind of interesting. If you take the word Veronica, you take ver and veritas, meaning true, and then icona, or Veronica, icona means then an icon, so a true image. So it's possible that was a true image of Jesus during the Passion, as he imprinted that while the women gave him a face cloth to wipe his face on. So it's possible that was the case.
Sure. So any other references that you've noticed in the first millennium to the shroud that would be noteworthy?
Not that come to mind at the moment. I've got a handful of different things that I'm actually writing a paper on right now on different artwork that refer to the shroud. And so one of the earliest artworks that could possibly have been based on the shroud as the prototype for that image is from about the 4th century. And then in the 5th century, there's a couple that are in the catacombs in Rome, and all of them have a beard for the first time. Previous to that, Jesus was never depicted with a beard. Most of them have that notch out of the beard. Most of them show the different bruises on the face. They show a couple of things with the hair and some blood markings on the forehead, and those are now pretty clear that as that painting and that depiction, either through a fresco or through a mosaic or through then a marble inlay, that those things are referencing something in common, and they have these markings that follow those images over the next 2 millennia. And what's interesting is that those images of Jesus don't change from the medieval times in the 13th century till modern times, even today. So the rough face of Jesus as we kind of know and think of him today is actually can be followed all the way back with those different markings all the way back to about the 4th century.
Now, what about the second millennium? What all do we see there?
Yeah, I don't know if I've got a really good evidence there. I don't have any pictures that I've seen myself. Certainly, there are a couple of different ones. I think the different Gospels. Actually, when you think about it, they were written towards the end of the 1st century and then into the 2nd century, and so those could be potentially some sources as to that there was a cloth. And then, of course, Paul in Galatians, I think, was written maybe in 48 AD. So it's possible, like I was saying with that one. There are a couple of other references. Of course, they're a little bit obscure. I'd have to take out one of my books and then we could go through it. Jack Marquardt, if you're really interested in it, he's got some really, really good stuff going all the way up through modern times, and lists out a handful of different things. Ian Wilson is another one that writes and has quite a few different references to different potential proofs that that the image exists.
Now, what would be some good arguments in favor of its authenticity in your estimation?
Yeah, sure. Well, there's been a handful of different studies on it. The one that I like is the that I'll bring up first is the pollen study.
Mhm.
So there was a guy, Max Fry. He was a criminologist in Switzerland, and he took pollen samples off of the shroud, and then tried to understand where those different pollens came from. So if Jesus was buried in April, it was crucified in April, then you would expect to see potentially pollen from that would have been blooming at that time, and then you would see pollen maybe wherever that the shroud went. So there's definitely pollen from plants that are found today in the Palestine area. So that's one proof. The next proof is that there's pollen from eastern Turkey. And Turkey in general. So it's probable that the shroud went that far and went into eastern Turkey. And then, of course, there's pollen now from the medieval times. So the path that the shroud took is most likely Jerusalem, Antioch. There's a potential theory where it went through Edessa, which is eastern Turkey, through maybe the 6th century, possibly through the 10th century. Then it was in Istanbul from at least the 6th century to the 10th century, and then definitely in the 10th century to the 12th century, and then over to Europe. And so then there's pollen from each of those different regions where it potentially was. And it's before where it's believed to have been prior to the medieval times. And then what that would mean is that a medieval artist, if he was going to forge this, would have had to have known to have collected pollen from Palestine, collected pollen from Turkey, and then sprinkle it on the cloth once the thing was painted.
Yeah,
So
pretty absurd, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Hard to really believe that somebody would go to that much trouble.
Well, that number one. Number two, there is what's called aragonite dust on the nose and on the feet and on the knees. So and in those locations on the shroud. So the painter. And the aragonite dust is very specific to the dust that's found on the streets in Jerusalem. So the painter, the forger, would have had to have known to go get that specific type of dust and then sprinkle it on the nose of the forgery, and on the knees of the forgery, and on the toes of the forgery. So that's another kind of proof of just some of the things that are found on the cloth. Not even to mention now actually painting the cloth. So
when did this technology begin? where we were able to ascertain where this pollen comes from. Wouldn't that be kind
Yeah.
of a recent thing?
Well, it's interesting because this guy Fry, Max Fry, he had been putting together a pollen database, and then I believe what he did is, he had it for Switzerland because he was a criminologist, and he was trying to then use that as a way to prove that this body was killed or what have you, and where it was killed. And then he started to collect different pollen samples from around the world, and then he built up a whole database of different pollen samples to be able to do further proofs outside of his home country.
Okay. So we got pollen samples. What else strikes you as noteworthy?
Yeah. So the next thing is, first of all, the negative quality. So I mentioned that where the negative quality of the image is actually stronger than the positive, and so then the painter would actually have to paint in negative. Now, negatives had not been invented yet. So in medieval times, in the 13th, 14th century, painting in negative had not been invented yet. And there's no proof of any even trials of painting a negative image. So I remember I went to the Chagall Museum in southern France one time, and he did the beautiful paintings. But around the outside, he would do all of these little trials of how he wanted to paint it. And so, like, he'd want to paint a face, so he'd kind of do the outline of a face and things like that. He'd want to draw a hand in a certain way, and he'd do an outline of that. And so if I was going to paint something in the negative, as an artist, I would want to do a whole bunch of trials first and make sure that I knew how to paint it like that. And so then those don't exist. They're never anywhere. There's no other paintings that are painted in this way that can be dated to the medieval times. The second thing, though, that's more important even on the image is the fact that the image actually has 3D qualities. And this was discovered in roughly 1976, 77. And what that meant is that the Air Force was was trying to understand the layout of the ground by taking pictures of the landscape and pictures of the ground, so that they could then see where the hills were and the valleys and things like that. And then John Jackson, one of the big scientists in the shroud world, he said, I wonder if there's any 3D information on the shroud. And so he put in first a picture of his kids, and when you put a regular 2D picture, you get it doesn't look right. The 3D transformation of a 2D picture doesn't add any value.
Okay.
However, when you take a 3D image of the 3D image on the shroud, you actually see that there's encoded into the image 3D qualities. So you can see that the nose raises up, the cheeks are lower down, the eyebrows are there, the hands are there, the whole body then can be seen as having true, realistic 3D qualities in the image. And so the question then is, how could somebody in the 13th century know how to paint in a 3D quality? Now, the last thing on the image and the painting in the terms of the forgery, I think, is also interesting. Normally, what you would do is, if you were going to put blood on an image, you would paint the image all the way across. So you'd paint then the chest and the face and whatever, and then you would sprinkle the blood based on where you thought the blood would be. So you'd have, the blood wounds from the crown of thorns. You'd have then the blood wounds from the scourging. You'd have the blood leaking out of his palms, out of his hands and wrists. You'd have then a big, huge leak coming out of his side from the side wound. And what's interesting is that the blood is on the cloth first, and then the image was made. There is no image underneath the blood, which means that it's kind of backwards in terms of how a forger might want to paint it, which would be to paint the whole body and then sprinkle the blood on afterward. The shroud is the blood went on first, and then the image was created, which corresponds kind of to the timeline of the burial, where he's buried in the cloth. The blood somehow soaks into the cloth, and then the resurrection, the moment of resurrection, then actually generates that image.
Do you happen to have any images of the 3D rendering? Just curious.
Yeah, I do. I can, while we're talking here, I can certainly look for some.
Yeah, I'd like to see this if
Yeah,
possible.
let's see here. 3D rendering.
But I mean that would then just further substantiate the thesis that this isn't something that somebody just kind of drew
Yeah,
on, yeah, on the cloth.
yeah, exactly, exactly. And well, this is not quite. No, that's not going to be good. Let me see if I can find one with Pete Schumacher.
Mhm.
He's the guy that actually helped John Jackson, as I was talking about, do the 3D imaging. And here's this. So now I need to figure out how to share my screen. Where do I see
Yeah,
that?
go to the bottom where it says present, click on
Got it.
that, click
Okay.
share screen, go
Yep.
to where it says entire screen, click on that, select the
Share.
screen that you want and hit share.
Okay. Let's do that. And I want to do that one there. I think it's just going to pull up the that one. Can you see that?
I can, yeah.
All right. So just a couple of things. So this is Pete Schumacher in the blue shirt, and he has what is called a VP8 image analyzer. It was this VP8 image analyzer that was more or less used by the Air Force to determine the the 3D qualities of satellite images and be able to render and understand the hills and valleys. And in that green there on the TV screen, and of course this is an old CRT, is the first kind of 3D images. Now on the right, you'll see the 3D image that really gets produced by the VP8 image analyzer now, and in this case, it's now in tan and brown colors. But you can see that there's 3D encoding, that's pretty obvious in the face there. So you can see the nose sticking up, you can see the mustache, you can see the hair, the hair tresses on the sides of the head, and things like that. And so you can really see the 3D image that comes out of the work that they did.
Wow, that's awesome.
Yeah, and so the question then is, if I were a forger, how would I know to develop something in 3D when I'm painting in 2D? So the forger has to then have the concept, which was not around in the 13th, 14th century, have the concept in their mind that I'm going to paint this in some fashion in 3D.
Yeah, if you're trying to deceive people, you wouldn't go to that kind of length. You would just go for whatever is sufficient, and that's it.
And
Well,
what's
I mean,
interesting,
oh no,
what's
go ahead.
interesting, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, I mean, well, is it possible that these things could have happened naturally without an intention to forge, but it's some other explanation than it being the shroud?
Yeah, there's possibly one of there's a couple of different theories as to what created the image. It's definitely been determined it's not a paint, a dye, a scorch, or anything like that. There is one theory that's potentially a chemical theory that that gases coming off of the body may have created the image and reacting with something that took place in the tomb. The other theory is that there was as the process of the resurrection, there was a neutron burst,
Mm.
and the neutron burst then may have imparted that image on the top fibers of the shroud and of the linen cloth. So there's a couple of different theories there. Um, my gut is that we'll probably never ever figure that out. They have been able to replicate a couple of ways using an excimer laser, but in terms of being able to reproduce it in 100%, nobody's been able to figure that out exactly. Yeah, and I see in the notes there it's called the Maillard reaction.
Mhm, mhm.
Kelly Kearse and Barry Schwartz have put together some interesting papers on that, and so it's possible that's one of them.
So we have pollen, 3D imaging. What else would you say helps substantiate
Yeah,
the claim
pollen
that this is?
3D imaging, the aragonite dust. You have the black and white You have you have then the paintings, so that the paintings actually bring you back at least down to the 4th century, that reasonably replicate the image that you see on the on the linen.
What are some common objections that you tend to hear? I'm sure dating is one of them.
Yeah, yeah, and the biggest objection, and it's really a shame, is most people think that radiocarbon dating is the gold standard in dating an archaeological artifact, an organic archaeological artifact. So it can only, date things like, plant material or human bodies or human tissue or animal tissue or things like that. It can't date rocks and stones and things like that. And it's radiocarbon dating. So what it does is it looks at you take a sample of the artifact, and then what you do is you burn it, and what you're interested in is determining what the ratio is of carbon-12 to carbon-14, and it's that ratio then that is what then is measured, and then using the decay rates and other things, then you can work backward as to how far in time that artifact may have been created. So in 1988, in October of 1988, there was a team of scientists organized through the British Museum, and they took a sample from the cloth, one of the corners, and then they put that through the radiocarbon dating, and the results of that came up with a date of 1260 to 1390. And that sent the shroud world into a tizzy, and basically it kind of it really then stymied a lot of research that had been going on, and then as the process and as the news of that unfolded, and by the way, one of the big news items that came out, which was in February of 1989, which was Nature magazine, took then the data that was there, did a peer review of that carbon dating, and then wrote an article on it. And that article now, over the last whatever that is, 30 years, has been the radiocarbon dating of that time has been totally debunked. Number one, and number two, then what we're trying to do is we have a petition going right now at guypowell.com/petition. We have a petition going where we are now trying to get Nature magazine to retract that article because it is so erroneous. So a couple of things about the radiocarbon dating and why it was erroneous. Joe Marino, who is one of the well-known shroud scientists, researchers, he put out a book called the 1988 C14 dating of the Shroud of Turin, a stunning expose. And what's interesting about this is all of the politics and all of the things that went wrong in dating, in putting that dating process together. The first thing is you would never want to just take one sample of the material and do your dating on that. You would want to take, a sample from this corner, from that side, wherever, and do it from a couple of different places so that you could kind of have a set of different areas that in case there was contamination in one area or something wrong or a repair in the other area, you'd want to be able to see that. Secondly, then what you'd want to do is maybe use more than one method to do to actually do the radiocarbon dating. And there were two methods available at the time. They chose to do only one. They chose to pick only one sample location, and they chose to pick only one radiocarbon dating method. Now, they did use 3 labs. In the process of going up to the testing and the sample taking, there was actually agreement they wanted to use 7 different labs, and they wanted to use a handful of different locations on the shroud. And unfortunately, the politics, the geopolitics, the religious politics, this politics, and it's all documented in Joe's book, that was totally negated, and there was only 3 labs taken and using one method. Then, of course, you have you would want the process to be confidential. You would want it so that the labs would not tell each other what they found. And because you want to have that managed by an independent party so that they could say, okay, this lab got this date, that lab got that date, and then do the analysis, the statistical analysis on that. The second thing you would want to do is you would want to give them a blind sample. The original protocol was to have 2 control samples and then 1 sample from the Turin shroud. Those blind samples would be disguised in some fashion so that the labs would not know which one was the Turin sample and which ones were the control samples. Unfortunately, they only gave 1 sample, and it was pretty obvious they didn't properly disguise the samples to be able to make it so that the labs wouldn't know which one was which. Then the biggest thing that went wrong, in my opinion, and there's probably 4 or 5 other things that I've got a list here of what went wrong, and is that they did the statistics wrong. Now, I don't know about you, but when I went to college, I hated statistics.
Yeah.
I couldn't figure it. I couldn't understand. I understood averages and means. I didn't know what a mode was. I couldn't figure that stuff out. Hated it.
I remember this stuff. Yes.
Sorry to bring it up. I'm ruining the whole podcast.
Taking me back to these horrific days.
Exactly. So one of the things that came out of the statistics and was hidden, that's really key, was hidden for 20 years by the British Museum, was the actual dates of each of the individual samples and each of the individual subsamples that were cut from the original samples that each of the labs got. When you line all them up from one edge of the shroud cloth moving towards the center, you end up with what's called a systematic error. The systematic error says that it's like 1260 at one point, then 1270 at the next one, 1280, 1290, 1300, blah, 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 all the way up to 1390. Well, if you follow that statistics, that systematic error, you actually end up with a date in the future around the point where the head is, around the center of the cloth. The British Museum hid that. I'm going to say allegedly hid that systematic error was there. They did the statistics wrong, which is kind of hard to believe because statistics is and was a very mature type of a science or a mathematical study. So there's no reason why they should have ever done that. The samples themselves between the labs also were not where the averages of the samples were also not done properly. You couldn't equivalize the three different the ages that each of the 3 labs got to each other. So there were other problems in the statistics, and it took a FOIA request to actually get that information. And then finally, once the FOIA request was fulfilled, it really did determine that there was allegedly something funny going on in how they did the statistics. And when the statistics were done, then it turned out that there was this systematic bias, and that systematic bias would lead to a date in the future of somewhere on the center of the cloth. And so that right there is really the full debunking of the radiocarbon dating. And that's again what my petition is about. Sorry, and I'm going to plug it, guypowell.com/petition. And our goal with the petition, and if your listeners could, is sign that petition. We are going to petition and call on Nature magazine to retract the article that they put out because it was absolutely erroneous. And we want to get them to retract it. And so we're in the process of building a following through your show and other sources. So that right there is probably the biggest thing that the non or the anti-authenticists or the non-shroudists kind of use as why the shroud is false. And that one proof is just been proven, has just been totally debunked.
Have any of the people who participated in the dating come out and said, yeah, this was wrong, we were biased, or we made mistakes?
Not that I'm aware of. And as a matter of fact, after the October 1988 announcement, within 30 days or 60 days, 2 of the people on the shroud on this committee with the British Museum. Actually, one of them got about $100,000 in contributions to their lab. Another one got £1,000,000, 100,000
Huh.
pounds and £1,000,000. So there was monetary value for them in definitely, showing that the shroud was a fake.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's hard to believe. Now, I just noticed there's a note on one of the comments there. Why does the Catholic Church not say that the shroud is either authentic or not? And I think there's a couple of things going on. There's certainly, church politics. I think they were sufficiently burned by this 1988 dating, radiocarbon dating, that they just said, we're just not going to get involved in it anymore. And so what Pope John Paul II says is that the shroud is a reflection of the Gospels, and I think the church isn't going to go any further. Pope Francis today, his opinion is that he's just not interested. He just he's totally not interested. And what that means is then we can't even go back in and do any further testing to really to further debunk the radiocarbon dating, and also then hopefully provide some other scientific studies to get some more data on it. And unfortunately, the shroud is now basically locked up, and nobody has access to it. Now, over time, there have been popes that have said that the shroud is authentic. Going back, a handful of centuries. Some of them say, yes, it's authentic. No, it's not authentic. Then yes, it's authentic. No, it's not. So the church itself has gone back and forth. And be honest with you, I think there's, they probably, it's probably the right thing for them not to even, try and wade into those waters. I think it would be good for them, though, to open the shroud up to have some limited testing to it, but not necessarily for them to come out and say, yes, it's authentic, or no, it's not authentic.
Yeah, it doesn't seem that the church has the authority to be able to determine such things. You can speak about matters of faith and morals and matters of science and fact insofar as they necessarily impact matters of faith and morals, but this doesn't fall within that
Yeah.
scope. And so it would be like the church trying to weigh in on some really complex math problem. I mean, it just, it's just kind of outside of the scope of the authority of the magisterium. So, yeah.
Yeah. And plus, as a Christian, you don't need the shroud to be able to prove that Jesus, is our Lord.
Right.
That Jesus was resurrected. Now, Thomas, of course, I think for a lot of people, with doubting Thomas, I want to stick my fingers in the wounds. And, okay, absolutely. Everybody has doubts. But as a Christian, you shouldn't need to have that kind of proof to really have that belief that, yes, Jesus was here. He died for our sins, and, and he is our Savior.
All right. Right. Yeah. It seems to, at that point, be contrary to the virtue of faith. It's great to have something. It's great to have reason to confirm our faith, but it certainly can't replace it.
Right.
Or act as a substitute for it. Here's a question for you from Real Seekers. What does Guy think about the failed 1983 intercomparison test that proved the C14 dating was off by more than half the known age of various samples?
Yeah, the 1988, I think he means. I think, definitely debunked, like I said. And I think I kind of answered most of that question, unless I'm missing something in there. That radiocarbon dating, the 1988 radiocarbon dating, definitely, totally debunked, based on what I mentioned.
V asks, is it possible to sequence the DNA on the shroud?
That has been looked at. There has been some thoughts about doing that. There's actually a big problem with trying to take the blood that's on the shroud and then doing a sequence on it. And the biggest challenge is that over the 2,000 years that the shroud is supposedly been in existence, that there were many, many people that handled it. If you look behind me, that picture there, that's what's called an ostension from 1613. And you can see along the top of the shroud that a handful of bishops are holding onto it. During the life of the shroud as well, there's been repairs to it and things like that. So nuns and others have touched it and got their grease and grime on it and DNA probably on it. So unfortunately, and very different than like a mummy. The mummy was locked up for however many years, right? 2, 3, 4,000 years, whereas the shroud itself has not been locked up and been handled by hundreds, maybe thousands of people. And unfortunately, that DNA now is corrupted. And I think there's also some thinking that that the DNA may have actually started to decay, and there may not actually be a really good sample of DNA actually available to do a good DNA test on it.
John B says, ask about the left arm blood dripping from the wrist down the arm, creating a pool of blood by the elbow.
Yeah, exactly. So, and John Jackson has done some interesting studies on this. So there's two things. First of all, it's believed that so Jesus was nailed to the cross, and while he was nailed to the cross, the nail probably punctured some blood vessels, so there may have been a handful of drops coming down the arms. And while the hands were up there, then you can see the flows of the blood flows on his arms and across his wrists, and then going down to his elbow. And it's interesting because you can also see that the blood flows go in both directions on one arm, where Jesus may have been writhing back and forth to try and breathe potentially, and maybe even alleviate some of the pain that he was in. And so then you can see the blood flows going back and forth, and some of that blood then is on his arm. Some of that then potentially dripped down all the way down to his elbow, and you can see that it's on one side of the shroud. On the front side, the blood flows, and then on the back side, there's a couple of drops that are on the elbow, and on the dorsal side of the shroud, and so there's a couple of drops on that side, which then kind of seem to be that this drip was liquid while it was under the shroud, and then it dripped off of his elbow. Now that actually brings up an interesting point: is how could the blood have been liquid? And there's a handful of theories as to why it may or may not have been liquid in the tomb, as opposed to having scabbed up or whatever.
The next question here is from Real Seekers. Originally, Stirp planned to conduct 26 scientific tests. Why were all those canceled except for the C-14 and 88 as part of Stirp 2.0?
Yeah, so what Real Seekers is talking about is 1978 was the original Stirp. And then when they got done and put all their reports together, they said, hey, here's a handful of studies that we'd like to complete, including a radiocarbon dating testing. And they were originally part of the design of the radiocarbon dating. And what they wanted to do was they wanted to get access to the shroud again. They spent 120 hours, 5 days with the shroud in 1978. They wanted to do similar things, except now as a round two. And unfortunately, there was a lot of politics. A lot of the politics wanted to actually keep Stirp out of it. Stirp was probably at the time the most prominent and most knowledgeable scientifically of the shroud, and they would have been the most logical group to actually do the study in 1988. However, the politics were against them, and they were basically booted out of the any testing that would have been done. So in 1988, the only test that was done was the carbon-14, and it was done totally without any help from Stirp. And this was kind of the global, religious, whatever politics you might want to, call it, that was going on.
Kenneth Walker says, have there been any miracles attributed to the Shroud of Turin?
Well, There have been some potentially modern ones. There is an exorcist who happens to have a thread of the shroud, and as part of his exorcisms, he has claimed he used the thread to actually exorcise a demon out of one of his patients, I guess you call it. And so there are things like that. There's actually an interesting piece to it as well. The shroud itself is called a primary relic. That means that it touched the body of Jesus. That's the definition of a primary relic. Now, the terminology, I think, is different depending upon where you are. But during Stirp, right at the end of Stirp, the archbishop who was in charge of the testing on the church side, he said, "You guys have been so good about doing your testing. You had gloves on the whole time. I'm now going to allow you to take your gloves off and physically touch the shroud." And so then the whole Stirp team touched the shroud. And so one of those people was Barry Schwartz. And so he then became a secondary relic. And so then he's now a secondary relic. Now, I met Barry in Houston about 6-8 months ago, and I shook his hand. So I am now a tertiary relic.
In third class. There you go.
That's right. Exactly. So, and then if we were then in person, I'd shake your hand, and you could claim to be
fourth class. Yeah, that would work.
Exactly.
That's
Exactly.
great. All right. So
so I don't know if that answers your question. I don't delve into miracles on the one side, but definitely, an interesting, and it's possible. There's certainly options, and there's definitely thoughts that back in the early centuries, that it may have actually contributed to some miracles.
Ramsey says, ask about which ribs the image shows the wound on the side to be. It seems too high for me. This is the image, by the way.
Yep. And you can see on the left side there of the images, you can see a blotch. That is the blood that would have come out of the lance, the lance wound that would have pierced the heart and probably believed to have pierced the lungs as well. I don't remember exactly which ones it is. It's documented. You can look it up, but it goes between the ribs. And but what's really interesting about that wound is a lot of people say, well, if he's dead, how could there be blood coming out of it? And one of the things is that most likely when he was hanging on the cross, his lungs were filling up with liquid from the stress of the scourging, from the stress of the of hanging on the cross. He actually would have had to lift himself up in order to breathe, and that's partially because his rib cage would have been expanded, but also partially because his lungs were filling up with blood and blood serum. And so then when he was pierced, and when that lance went through, it pierced the heart and pierced the lungs. And then when the lance was removed, that's when you would see water coming out, which is mentioned in the Gospels, and then blood coming out. And you can see actually on the shroud, you can see that blood stain there, that big blotch. But around that blood stain is a halo, and that's the blood serum halo that is due to the liquid that was still liquid inside his lungs.
Very helpful. I think we may have grabbed all of the chat questions. So maybe any concluding thoughts or material that you wanted to sneak in there that we didn't get to.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, again, my book, I'm going to do a blatant plug here, The Only Witness. It's on Amazon, and would love it if you like it, please write a review. It's been doing very well, and always appreciate anybody to get a hold of it. It's an easy read. The idea is to bring folks to get a Christian message without necessarily kind of forcing it on them, so to speak. It's part of the story and it's ingrained in there. But the most important thing today, Michael, and I really appreciate you having me on and being able to do this, is please go to guypowell.com/petition. We are looking for people to sign that petition, because in a few weeks we are going to, and there it is right there, we are going to send a letter to the Nature magazine to get them to retract that article. And if you keep going down, if you're interested, yep, there we go. If you keep going down, then there's a handful of articles that provide proof of different areas as to why that radiocarbon dating is incorrect.
Okay. Yeah. You click on it. It's pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Just
Yep.
name and email.
Yep.
Okay,
Absolutely.
Cool.
Yeah, it's very simple.
We'll
No,
be doing
please do that, and I really appreciate it, and go from there.
Awesome. And there, Archie says, I want to shake his hand. So there are now people who want to.
Well, here we go.
Yeah,
We'll do a virtual handshake.
They want to be fourth class relics now.
Yeah, you are now a virtual fourth class relic. Thank you, Archie. Appreciate it.
Are there any open questions on the Shroud? Great Wall asks.
Yeah. Oh, there are so many. I mean, there are just so many. The biggest one, of course, is what caused the image? What made that image? How was it made? And I don't know. At least for the time being, I don't see, anything being able to figure that out without actually getting, the scientists in there and actually doing studies on it. And even then, they may come up with the same conclusion. It's kind of funny. A lot of people think that the purpose of STIRP was to determine if the shroud was real, and that is totally incorrect. The STIRP team was to determine what caused the image, not whether the shroud was authentic or not. They wanted to know what caused the image, and they spent 120 hours straight, 5 days, with whatever it was, 25 scientists with a very rigorous test plan, and they were not able to come up with a methodology that said this is what caused that image.
Testing done in 2022 that showed it was first century. Have you heard of this?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I haven't. There's been testing that's been done on pieces that have been cut from the shroud. So there's a handful of threads and little pieces that have been done, and I'm not sure if that's what you're referring to. All of the tests, there have been chemical tests. So Ray Rogers did a test which was looking at the decay of the fibers of the linen, and there's a chemical in there, it's called lignin, and there's another chemical that's called vanillin, and vanillin then decays over time, and based on that decay rate you can kind of get close to determining when the linen was cut, when the flax was cut to be made into that linen, and it kind of comes up to somewhere in the couple of centuries BC, couple of centuries AD. So it's that's one of them that's been done recently, and that one's kind of interesting. If Ray Rogers had been part of the British Museum, he would have said there's no vanillin in the lignin. He wouldn't have said 1260 to 1390. He would have said there's no vanillin in the lignin. And just kind of a fun thing. And I talk about that story, by the way, in my book. And so.
Well, thank you so much for coming on and doing this. Very insightful. I put a link to your website where y'all can go to sign the petition and also check out your books. Very helpful. Thank you so much. You're welcome to come back on the show anytime you want to do it.
Thank you, Michael. Really appreciate it, and appreciate everybody and your questions. Thank you so much.
And everybody, thank y'all so much for watching. Don't forget to hit that like button and the subscribe button. See you later. God bless.